Trapped by a blizzard in a reclusive judge's mountain fortress, a desperate journalist came seeking a story. But as the storm raged, she began to uncover the dark secrets of his past and a dangerous truth that threatened to consume them both. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. The snow was not falling, it was attacking. Wendy Butler gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, as the wind threw another sheet of blinding white against her windshield. The mountain pass, which had been merely treacherous an hour ago, had become a churning vortex of ice and fury. Her desperation had made her reckless, pushing her car and her luck up a road that the locals knew to abandon at the first sign of a storm. But the tip she'd received was too good to ignore. Judge Gregory Ross was here in his isolated fortress, and a face-to-face encounter was the only way to get the story that would save her career. The car's tires lost their conversation with the asphalt. There was a sickening, weightless slide, a moment of pure adrenaline-fueled terror as the world became a chaotic tumble of white and black. The metallic scream of twisting steel was abruptly cut short by a brutal, jarring impact that threw her against her seatbelt, stealing the air from her lungs. Then, silence. A profound, ringing silence, broken only by the relentless howl of the wind. A sharp, searing pain shot through her leg, and the cold, a living, breathing entity began to seep through the shattered window, its icy fingers searching for her skin. She tried the door, but it was hopelessly jammed. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. She was trapped, injured, and a dying battery meant her phone was useless. The world had shrunk to this small, freezing metal box, and the famous reclusive judge felt as far away as the sun. She laid her head back against the seat, a wave of dizziness washing over her. The edges of her vision began to darken, the howling of the wind softening into a distant, lulling whisper. This was it. This was how the story ended. Not with a byline, but with a frozen, forgotten headline in the spring thaw. Through the dizzying snow and the fog of her fading consciousness, a shape emerged, a dark silhouette against the chaos of white, growing steadily larger, more defined. It was a man, tall and broad, moving with a purpose and strength that seemed to defy the storm itself. The figure reached her car. The passenger door was wrenched open with a groan of protesting metal, and a blast of frigid air shocked her back to a sharper awareness. He leaned in, and all she could see were his eyes, a startling, piercing gray, as cold and as clear as a winter sky. He didn't speak. His movements were efficient, economical, as he assessed her condition with a practiced calm. He unbuckled her seatbelt, and with a strength that seemed almost impossible, he gently but firmly lifted her from the wreck. As he pulled her into the shelter of his heavy wool coat, the scent of pine, cold air, and something else, something like old books and quiet authority, filled her senses. She looked up at the sharp, aristocratic lines of his face, a face she had only ever seen in grainy newspaper photos. The world tilted on its axis, and a single, terrifying thought crystallized in her mind before the darkness finally took her. She had been rescued. She was being carried through the heart of the blizzard, cradled in the arms of the one man she was willing to risk her life to find. She was being saved by Judge Gregory Ross, and in the arms of the man whose secrets she had come to expose, she felt a terrifying, unwilling flicker of gratitude. Wendy woke up to the sound of a crackling fire and the heavy scent of cedar. For a moment she was disoriented, adrift in a warm, comfortable fog, the memory of the cold and the crash feeling like a distant nightmare. She was lying on a low, modern sofa, covered by a cashmere blanket that was impossibly soft and warm. Her head throbbed with a dull ache, and a neatly bandaged dressing was wrapped around her lower leg, the pain now a distant, manageable pulse. She pushed herself up slowly, her senses gradually coming into focus. The room was vast, a testament to minimalist luxury. One entire wall was a sheet of plate glass, revealing a breathtaking, terrifying view of the blizzard that still raged outside, a chaotic ballet of snow and wind. The interior, by contrast, was a sanctuary of absolute order. Polished concrete floors, clean lines, and dark wood accents created a space that was as beautiful as it was cold and impersonal. It was not a home. It was a statement. It was the Eyrie, Gregory Ross's infamous mountain fortress, and it felt like being inside a diamond. Perfect, brilliant, and hard. He was standing by the immense stone fireplace, his back to her, one hand resting on the mantel. He was no longer the apparition in the storm, but a man of flesh and blood, dressed in a simple dark gray sweater and trousers. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, his very presence seeming to command the silence of the room. He turned, sensing she was awake, and his gray eyes met hers. They held no warmth, no sympathy, only a calm, analytical assessment. He was a judge, and she felt like a piece of evidence he was examining. "You were lucky," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that filled the quiet space. "Another 30 minutes out there and your luck would have run out. Your leg is bruised, possibly a minor fracture. I am not a doctor, but I have done what I can. The storm has taken out the power lines and the phone service. We are, for all intents and purposes, cut off from the world." His words were delivered as a statement of fact, devoid of any emotion. He was simply laying out the terms of her confinement. Wendy struggled to find her voice, the professional, assertive voice of a journalist. But it was gone, replaced by the shaky, uncertain voice of a patient, a victim. "Thank you," she managed to say, the words feeling inadequate. "You saved my life." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement of the fact, not an acceptance of her gratitude. He was not a man who dealt in the messy currency of human emotion. He dealt in facts, in logic, in the cold, hard lines of the law. He walked over to a small, sleek kitchen area and returned with a glass of water, handing it to her. His fingers brushed hers, a brief accidental contact, and his skin was surprisingly warm, a stark contrast to the icy control he projected. For a moment she saw something flicker in his eyes, a shadow of something other than detached analysis, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He was a fortress, and his walls were high and thick. She was his guest, his patient, and his prisoner. Trapped by the storm, she was entirely at his mercy, a fact he seemed neither to enjoy nor to dislike. It simply was. And as she looked around the beautiful, sterile cage he called a home, she realized that the safety he offered felt infinitely more dangerous than the blizzard. The first 24 hours passed in a slow, silent procession of hours. Gregory Ross was a ghost in his own house, present but rarely seen. He would appear to bring her food, simple, nourishing meals he prepared with an unnerving efficiency, or to check the dressing on her leg. His touch always professional, detached, and brief. He spoke only when necessary, his words precise and to the point. Wendy, accustomed to filling silence with questions, found herself silenced by the sheer weight of his reserve. She was a journalist without her tools. No phone, no recorder, no way to penetrate his defenses. She spent her time on the sofa, her leg propped up, watching the storm. It was like watching the world end in a slow, beautiful apocalypse. The snow piled up against the great glass windows, creating a feeling of being submerged, of being in a luxurious underwater cave. She tried to work in her head, piecing together the questions she would ask him if she ever got the chance, but her thoughts were muddled by the constant, low-grade pain in her leg and the overwhelming presence of the man who moved so silently through the house. Late on the second night, she woke from a fitful doze. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. She could hear the storm, a low, mournful howl in the chimney. And then she heard another sound, a human sound, startling in the oppressive silence. It was coming from a wing of the house she hadn't seen, a low, guttural murmur. It was the sound of a man, caught in the grips of a nightmare. Curiosity, that dangerous professional instinct, overrode her caution. Moving slowly, painfully, she used a discarded walking stick he had left for her and limped toward the sound. She found him in a large armchair in his library, a room as vast and silent as the main living area. He had clearly fallen asleep while reading. A heavy, leather-bound book had slid from his lap onto the floor. His head was thrown back, his face etched with a torment that was terrifying to behold. The iron control was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded anguish. He murmured something, a string of broken words, and then a name. A woman's name, spoken with a clarity that cut through the silence like a shard of glass. "Annalise," he whispered, the name a raw, open wound. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The words were an agony, a confession to a ghost in a room that was supposed to be empty. Wendy froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Annalise. The name was not in any of her research files. It was a new piece of the puzzle, a key she hadn't known existed. He fell silent then, his breathing evening out, the torment receding from his features, leaving him looking exhausted, vulnerable, and profoundly human. She stood in the shadows of the doorway, a voyeur to his private grief. A part of her, the ruthless journalist, cataloged the name, filed away the raw emotion. This was it. This was the crack in the fortress wall. This was the beginning of her story. But as she looked at the unguarded pain on his sleeping face, another, softer feeling stirred within her. She knew she should see it as a clue, the first thread she could pull to unravel him. But all she felt was the undeniable, unprofessional urge to understand his sorrow. The name Annalise echoed in the silence of the following day, a silent third presence in the vast, quiet house. Wendy watched Gregory, searching for any trace of the tormented man from the library, but the mask was firmly back in place. He was as remote and controlled as ever, his gray eyes revealing nothing. The vulnerability she had witnessed felt like a dream, a brief glimpse into a locked room before the door was slammed shut. And yet she knew what she had heard. The knowledge was a secret she now held, a fragile, dangerous key. Her leg was slowly improving, the sharp pain dulling to a persistent ache. He allowed her, with his silent, watchful supervision, to begin exploring the main living areas of the house. Every surface was immaculate, every object placed with intention. There were no photographs, no personal trinkets, no clutter of a life lived. It was the home of a man who had systematically erased his own history. The only room that felt truly alive was his library, with its thousands of books that smelled of leather and time. She limped into the library one afternoon, drawn by a need to understand the man through the only personal things he allowed himself, his books. She ran her fingers over the spines, a diverse collection ranging from ancient philosophy to modern forensic science. Tucked away on a bottom shelf, almost hidden from view, she found a collection of poetry. It seemed out of place in his world of logic and law. She pulled out a slim, worn volume, its cover softened with age. It fell open to a page marked with a faded, pressed flower, a single, delicate edelweiss. A woman's handwriting, elegant and flowing, was inscribed in the margin next to a poem about courage and mountains. For my Alistair, may you always find your strength in high places. All my love, A. Alistair, not Gregory, the name he had used in his old life, as a prosecutor, and A. for Annalise. Wendy's heart began to beat a little faster. This was not just a book, it was a relic, a ghost of a past love, a life he had tried to bury. She felt a jolt of journalistic adrenaline, the thrill of the hunt. This was the story. She was so absorbed in her discovery that she didn't hear him enter the room. "That book," he said, his voice quiet but sharp, making her jump. He was standing just a few feet away, his face a cold, hard mask, his eyes fixed on the book in her hands. For the first time, she saw a flicker of raw, undisguised anger in their gray depths. "It is not for you." He walked over and gently but firmly took the book from her hands, his fingers brushing against hers. The contact was like a spark of static electricity, a brief, sharp shock. He closed the book, the pressed flower and its secrets sealed away once more. He did not put it back on the shelf. He held it, his knuckles white, as if holding on to the last piece of a world that had been shattered. "My house is your shelter, Ms. Butler," he said, his voice dangerously low. "It is not your subject. Do not mistake my hospitality for an invitation to excavate my life." The warning was clear, the line drawn in the sand. He turned and left the room, taking the book with him, leaving her alone in the silence. The professional rebuff should have stung. But as she stood there, her hand still tingling from his touch, all she could feel was the profound, aching sadness of a man who had to lock away his own memories just to survive the day. The confrontation in the library created a new, more volatile tension between them. The polite distance was gone, replaced by a wary, watchful circling. He was aware of her as a threat now, and she was aware of him as a man with a past so painful he would protect it at any cost. The storm outside continued its assault, mirroring the emotional siege within the walls of the Eyrie. Wendy found herself confined to the sofa once more, not by her injury, but by his silent, formidable disapproval. He retreated completely, the brief flashes of connection they'd shared now extinguished. Meals were left for her on a side table. He no longer checked her bandage. The house grew colder, the silence heavier. For the first time, Wendy felt a flicker of genuine fear. She was trapped with a powerful man whose anger she had stoked, a man who had saved her life but now looked at her as if she were a hostile witness. She had come here seeking a story, but she had stumbled into a grief so profound it had the power to consume them both. One afternoon, desperate for a change of scenery, she limped to the immense glass wall that overlooked the valley. The blizzard had momentarily lessened, the snowfall softening, and through the swirling white she could see the faint, dark outlines of the mountains on the other side. It was a glimpse of the world beyond their prison, a promise that this would not last forever. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass, feeling a sudden, overwhelming wave of loneliness. "It's a phenomenon they call the white veil," he said, his voice startlingly close behind her. She turned to find him standing a few feet away, holding 2 steaming mugs. He had approached so silently, she hadn't heard him. His expression was no longer angry, but weary, resigned. It creates an illusion of peace, a moment of clarity in the heart of the chaos. It never lasts. He held out one of the mugs to her. It was hot chocolate, rich and dark, the scent of it a surprising comfort. She took the mug, their fingers brushing again. This time the touch lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. "Why did you come up here, Ms. Butler?" he asked, his voice quiet, devoid of accusation. It was a genuine question. "You're a journalist. There are 1,000 easier stories. Why me?" She met his gaze, and for the first time she decided to offer him a piece of her own truth. "Because my career is failing," she said, the confession feeling raw and honest. "I took a risk on a story that fell apart, and I damaged my credibility. I needed a win. I needed a story so compelling no one could ignore it." He looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face, and she saw a flicker of something that looked like empathy. "And you believe I am that story?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Some stories," he continued, his gaze drifting back to the storm, "are not meant to be told. They are meant to be survived." The sadness in his voice was profound, a deep, resonant ache that vibrated in the air between them. He was not just warning her off. He was confiding in her, sharing the weight of his own survival. He was a man who had survived something terrible, and in that moment he saw that she was just a woman trying to survive too. That shared moment of vulnerability at the window acted as a fragile truce. The icy wall between them had not vanished, but a small door had opened. They began to talk, not as journalist and subject, but as two people trapped by a storm. The conversations were hesitant at first, confined to neutral topics, books, the law, the unpredictable nature of mountain weather. But slowly, tentatively, they began to reveal small, carefully chosen pieces of themselves. She spoke of her childhood in a bustling city, a world away from this stark, silent beauty. He spoke surprisingly of his passion for woodworking, for creating order and form from a raw piece of timber. He began to join her for meals, sitting at the opposite end of a long, reclaimed wood table. The silence between them was no longer oppressive, but companionable. She found herself watching him, fascinated by the contrast between the powerful, controlled judge and the man who could speak with such quiet passion about the grain of a piece of oak. She saw the fine lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the immense weight of the solitude he had chosen for himself. Her professional curiosity was slowly being replaced by a much more dangerous, much more personal, human interest. One evening after dinner, he built a fire in the hearth, the flames casting a warm, dancing light across the room. He didn't retreat to his library as he usually did. Instead, he sat in a large armchair near the fire, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and simply watched the flames. Wendy sat on the sofa, a book open in her lap, but she wasn't reading. She was watching him. The flickering firelight softened the hard lines of his face, revealing a deep-seated sadness that was always present, just beneath the surface of his control. "What are you running from, Gregory?" she asked softly, the question slipping out before she could stop it. His name felt strange on her lips, too intimate, but Judge Ross felt absurd in this quiet, firelit room. He didn't stiffen or become angry as she had expected. He continued to stare into the fire, a long, heavy silence stretching between them. She thought he was going to ignore her, to retreat back behind his walls, and she regretted her impulsiveness. Not what? he finally said, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. Who? He took a slow sip of his whiskey, his eyes still fixed on the flames. I'm running from the man I used to be, the man who believed the law was a perfect instrument of justice, the man who believed he could make a difference, the man who believed he could protect the people he loved. Each phrase was a heavy stone dropped into the quiet pool of the room. He turned his head then and looked directly at her, and his eyes were raw, unguarded, filled with a grief so profound it stole her breath. That man was a fool, he said, his voice rough with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. And his folly cost someone everything. In that moment he was no longer a judge, no longer a story. He was a man confessing his deepest failure, his greatest regret, to the only person who could hear him. She saw the truth then, with a terrifying clarity. She had come here to uncover his past, but she was falling for the broken man it had left behind. His confession hung in the firelit air, a permanent and irrevocable shift in the landscape of their relationship. By naming his grief, he had given her a piece of it to hold. The dynamic of journalist and subject was gone, shattered by the weight of his raw human pain. In the days that followed, a new fragile intimacy began to grow between them. He no longer spoke of the past, but its ghost was always in the room, a silent witness to their burgeoning connection. The storm outside began to lose its fury, the blizzarding snow softening into a gentler, more consistent fall, but the storm inside the Eyrie was only just beginning to build. Wendy's leg was almost fully healed, her limp barely noticeable. She began to spend her days in his library, not as a journalist searching for clues, but as a guest seeking quiet companionship. They would sit for hours in comfortable silence, reading in separate armchairs as the snow fell outside the large picture window. Sometimes he would read a passage aloud from a book of case law, his voice a low melodic rumble, and she would find herself captivated not by the legal precedent, but by the passion for justice that still burned within him, buried beneath layers of regret. One evening she found him in his workshop, a place she hadn't seen before. It was a clean, orderly space that smelled of sawdust and wood varnish, a stark contrast to the sterile luxury of the rest of the house. He was standing over a large workbench, his sleeves rolled up, his hands carefully sanding a piece of dark, rich mahogany. He was so absorbed in his work, his brow furrowed in concentration, that he didn't hear her approach. She watched him for a moment, fascinated by this hidden facet of his personality. Here he was not a judge or a recluse. He was a creator, a craftsman. "It's beautiful," she said softly. He looked up, and he wasn't startled. A faint, rare smile touched his lips. "It's a cradle," he said, his voice softer in this space. He ran his hand over the smooth, curved wood. "I started it a long time ago. I never finished it." The words were simple, but the implication was devastating. It was a piece of a future that had never happened, a dream that had been abandoned. It was a tangible monument to the life Annalise and he were supposed to have. He looked at her, and the professional distance, the careful walls, were completely gone. There was only an unguarded, aching vulnerability in his eyes. "She loved the mountains," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She said they were the only thing that made the world feel quiet." He was sharing his memories with her, opening the door to the locked room of his past, not because she was a journalist, but because she was the only one there to listen. She took a tentative step closer, her heart aching for him, for the immense loss he carried. She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she placed it gently on his arm. His muscles tensed beneath her touch, but he didn't pull away. It was the first time she had touched him with deliberate, comforting intent. The contact was electric, a current of shared grief and burgeoning affection that passed between them. The air grew thick, charged with an emotion that was deeper than sympathy and more dangerous than curiosity. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then up to her face, his gaze intense, searching. The space between them shrank, the scent of sawdust and his skin filling her senses. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the desire warring with a lifetime of disciplined control. The moment in the workshop, with its unspoken grief and gentle, electrifying touch, became a point of no return. The invisible line between them had been crossed. They began to seek each other out. The long silences now filled with a low hum of awareness. A simple glance across the room held a conversation. The accidental brush of his hand against hers as he passed her a book was no longer accidental. The air in the house was thick with a tension that was no longer about his past, but about their present and their potential, terrifying future. One night, the storm finally broke. The relentless wind died down, and the clouds parted to reveal a sky of impossible, brilliant clarity, studded with 1,000,000 diamond-sharp stars. The moon rose over the snow-covered peaks, bathing the world in a pristine, ethereal light. It was a sight of such stark, breathtaking beauty it felt like a cleansing, a new beginning. Gregory stood before the great glass wall, staring out at the transformed landscape, his posture rigid, as if the return of the world beyond his fortress was an unwelcome intrusion. Wendy came to stand beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "It's over," she whispered, the words both a statement of fact and a question. He didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the moonlit mountains. "The storm is over," he said, his voice quiet, heavy, "which means the world will come rushing back in. Roads will be cleared. Phones will start ringing. Your world will come looking for you." There was a profound sadness in his voice, a deep, resonant regret that this strange, timeless period of isolation was coming to an end. "And you'll go back to being a story," he continued, finally turning to face her. In the pale, silver light, his face was a mask of conflicting emotions. "And I'll go back to being a ghost." The thought of leaving, of returning to her old life, hit Wendy with the force of a physical blow. The story she had been so desperate to find now seemed insignificant, a cheap, tawdry thing compared to the complex, broken, and beautiful man standing before her. She had come here for a headline, but she had found a home in the heart of a blizzard. "I don't want to go," she confessed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. A raw, honest admission of a truth she had been trying to deny. "I don't want this to be over." He looked at her, and the last of his iron control seemed to shatter. He reached out, his hand cupping her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheekbone. The touch was not hesitant or accidental this time. It was a deliberate, possessive, and infinitely tender claim. "Wendy," he murmured, her name a rough, aching sound in his throat. He leaned in, and the world narrowed to the few inches of space between them. The moonlight, the mountains, the silence, it all faded away, leaving only the intensity of his gaze, the warmth of his hand on her skin, and the promise of his lips. This was not a judge and a journalist. This was a man and a woman, standing on the edge of a precipice, about to take a leap into a dangerous, unknown, and utterly irresistible void. He was about to kiss her, and she knew that if he did, she would be lost forever. His kiss was not a gentle exploration. It was the desperate, starving kiss of a man who had denied himself for a lifetime. It was a release of all the grief, the loneliness, and the tightly leashed passion he had held locked away in the fortress of his heart. It was a kiss that tasted of whiskey, of solitude, and of a profound, aching need. Wendy met his hunger with her own, a surprising, fierce response that had been building in the quiet, watchful days of their confinement. Her hands came up to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer, erasing the last vestiges of space and doubt between them. This was not a surrender. It was a collision. It was messy and raw and utterly real. He backed her gently against the cold, unyielding glass of the window, his body a warm, solid shield against the night. The view of the perfect moonlit mountains was a stark backdrop to the beautiful, chaotic storm they had unleashed inside. His hands moved from her face to her waist, pulling her flesh against him, and she could feel the powerful, frantic beat of his heart against her own. Every rule she had for herself, every professional line she had ever drawn, turned to ash and blew away in the fire of his touch. He broke the kiss, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his forehead resting against hers. His eyes, when he opened them, were dark, turbulent pools of emotion. "You have no idea what you're doing," he whispered, his voice rough, a warning that sounded more like a plea. "You don't know what you're inviting into your life. The people from my past, they don't just disappear." The danger she had only sensed before was now being given a name, a voice. He was not just a man with a broken heart. He was a man with enemies. "Then tell me," she said, her voice steady, refusing to be scared away. "Trust me, Gregory. Tell me what you've been running from." He looked at her, a war raging in his eyes between the instinct to protect her by pushing her away and the desperate human need to pull her closer and finally share his burden. The journalist in her had wanted this, had hunted for this secret, but the woman who was falling in love with him just wanted to understand his pain, to stand with him against the ghosts that haunted him. He took her hand and led her to the fire, his grip tight, as if he were afraid she might vanish. He sat her down on the thick rug before the hearth and then began to pace, the caged energy of a man about to confess his sins. "The last case I prosecuted," he began, his voice low, strained. "It wasn't just a case. It was a war against the Delacourt family. Old money, vast power, and a network of corruption that ran so deep it was part of the city's foundations. They were untouchable," he continued, his voice laced with a bitter, familiar anger. "But I found a witness, someone on the inside brave enough to talk. Her name was Annalise." He stopped pacing and looked at her, and the grief on his face was so raw it was like a physical blow. "She wasn't just my witness, Wendy. She was my fiancée. And they killed her. They put a car bomb in her vehicle, and I watched it happen. They made sure I watched. The law couldn't touch them. So I buried Gregory Ross, the prosecutor, and came here to die. The truth, when it came, was more brutal, more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. She hadn't just stumbled upon a story. She had stumbled into the middle of a war that had never ended. The horrific truth of his past settled between them, a chilling, permanent entity. There was no going back to polite conversation or tentative touches. His confession had irrevocably bound them, intertwining her fate with the ghost of Annalise and the monstrous shadow of the Delacourt family. The intimacy they now shared was deeper, but it was also terrifying, forged in trauma and edged with a danger that was no longer abstract. Wendy looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not just a grieving man but a soldier who had survived a war and had been living in exile ever since. He didn't pull away after his confession. Instead, he sat beside her on the rug before the fire, taking her hand, his touch no longer hesitant but a firm, grounding anchor. He told her everything, the words pouring out of him as if a dam had finally broken. He spoke of the threats, the corruption, the impossible odds, and the fierce, brilliant courage of the woman he had loved. He spoke of his own arrogance, his belief that he could protect her, and the soul-crushing guilt he had carried every single day since her death. Wendy listened, her heart breaking for him, her journalistic instincts silenced by a wave of pure, profound empathy. As dawn broke, painting the snow-covered world in pale, hopeful shades of pink and gold, the first sound of the outside world intruded upon their sanctuary. It was faint, distant, but unmistakable, the low, mechanical growl of a snowplow, working its way up the mountain. The sound was a death knell for the timeless, isolated world they had inhabited. The end was coming. Gregory stood and walked to the window, his back rigid, his brief respite over. "They will reach the main road by noon," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the emotion of the night before. The judge was back, making a ruling. "Once the path to the house is cleared, you will take my vehicle. It's equipped for these conditions. You will drive down the mountain and you will not stop." He turned to face her, his eyes once again a cool, impenetrable gray. But now she could see the effort it took, the iron will required to rebuild his walls. "You will forget everything I told you last night," he continued, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You will forget the name Delacourt. You will forget the name Annalise. You will write your story about a reclusive judge who gave you shelter in a storm. It will be a human interest piece, it will be a lie, but it is the only story that ensures your safety." He was not asking her, he was commanding her. He was drawing a line not between them but around her, trying to place her outside the circle of danger that defined his life. She stood up, her legs feeling unsteady. "And you?" she asked, her voice a whisper. "What happens to you?" A flicker of something, sadness, regret, crossed his face before it was extinguished. "I go back to being a ghost," he said. "It is the only way I know how to survive." He was pushing her away, severing the bond they had forged, all in the name of protecting her. The logical, sensible part of her knew he was right, but the woman who had held his hand through the darkest night of his soul knew she couldn't possibly obey. She knew she could not leave him to fight his ghosts alone. The hours that followed were thick with a tense, heartbreaking finality. The sound of the snowplow grew steadily closer, a constant reminder of their impending separation. Wendy felt a frantic, desperate need to memorize everything. The way the light fell in his library, the scent of cedar and old books, the quiet, powerful stillness of his presence. She tried to reconcile the man who had kissed her with such desperate passion with the cold, remote judge who was now orchestrating her departure, with the efficiency of a courtroom clerk. Gregory was a man preparing for a siege. He brought a satellite phone from his study, a rugged military-grade device, and took it out onto the deck. Through the glass, Wendy watched him turn it on, his posture tense as he waited for a signal. He made a single brief call. His side of the conversation was clipped, sparse, and utterly chilling. "It's Ross," he said. "Protocol has been breached. A civilian, yes, compromised. No, contained for now. Stand by for further instructions." He ended the call, his face grim, his jaw tight. He came back inside, his eyes finding hers, and she saw a flicker of something she hadn't seen before. Fear. Not for himself, but for her. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "An old friend," he said evasively. "A necessary precaution." He walked over to the table where she had left her notebook, the one she had been scribbling in since the beginning of her ordeal. He picked it up, his expression unreadable, and flipped through the pages. He stopped on a page where a single word was written, circled several times, a journalist's instinct to lock onto the key detail. Delacourt. He looked from the name in her handwriting up to her face, and the cold fear in his eyes intensified. "They are not just a family, Wendy," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "They are an organization. They have resources, influence. They don't just eliminate threats. They erase them. They erase every friend, every family member, every loose end until the person and their story never existed." He stepped closer, his gaze burning into hers. "You came here as a journalist, looking for a story. You wrote down their name. If they ever find out that you were here, that you and I spoke for more than 5 minutes, they will see you as a loose end, a part of my story that needs to be erased." The full, terrifying weight of his words crashed down on her. The danger wasn't just his, it was hers now. It had been hers from the moment he pulled her from the wreck. He reached out, his hand resting on her shoulder, his grip tight, almost painful. The protector and the judge were warring within him. "By saving your life in that storm," he said, his voice rough with a terrible, dawning horror, "I may have just destroyed it." His words hung in the air, a death sentence delivered in a voice laced with guilt. The world Wendy had known, of deadlines, bylines, and ambitions, seemed like a childish fantasy compared to this brutal, terrifying reality. The sound of the snowplow was now deafeningly close. A path back to that world was being cleared, but she knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that she could never truly return to it. The knowledge of the Delacourts was a poison, and she was already infected. He packed a bag for her with silent, grim efficiency, thermal blankets, water, food. He was preparing her for survival, but it felt like he was preparing her for her own funeral. Every practical, protective gesture was an act of goodbye, a severing. They sat for one last meal, a soup he had made, the steam rising between them like a veil. The silence was absolute, filled with the 1,000 things they couldn't say. He loved her enough to send her away. She loved him enough to be terrified of leaving. She watched him across the table, memorizing the sharp line of his jaw, the profound sadness in his eyes. The story of a lifetime was hers for the taking. The name Delacourt, the testimony of the judge himself, it would be the kind of explosive, career-making exposé journalists dreamed of. It would vindicate her, make her a star. It would also, she now knew, get them both killed. The choice before her was stark, her ambition or their lives. After the meal, she walked into the library and straight to the fireplace where a low fire still burned. He followed her, his expression questioning, wary. Without a word, she opened her notebook to the page where she had written his confession, the details of Annalise's murder, the name Delacourt. She held his gaze for a long, meaningful moment, and then she ripped the pages out. One by one, she fed them to the flames, watching the ink blacken and curl, watching her ambition, her story, turn to ash. It was an oath, a vow of silence, a sacrifice. She was no longer a journalist in his house. She was his co-conspirator, his ally. She was choosing him. The act of destruction was the most constructive thing she had ever done. When the last page was gone, she turned to him. The shock on his face was profound. The reclusive judge, the man who trusted no one, was looking at her with an expression of stunned, raw, and overwhelming gratitude. He had been prepared to fight for her, but he had never imagined she would choose to fight alongside him. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides, pulling her into a fierce, desperate embrace. It was not a kiss of passion, but of allegiance. It was the embrace of 2 soldiers in a trench, the world outside about to explode. His arms were a steel band around her, holding on as if she were the only thing left in the world to save. He buried his face in her hair, his body trembling slightly. He was no longer pushing her away. He was holding on for dear life. The snowplow's engine idled just outside the house, its flashing lights painting the room in silent, rhythmic strokes of blue and red. The world had arrived. The arrival of the snowplow was an intrusion, a harsh, mechanical violation of their silent world. Gregory released her from his embrace, but he kept her hand, his grip a silent promise of solidarity. He walked to the door, Wendy beside him, and opened it to a blast of frigid, clean air. The driver, a weathered local man, tipped his hat, his expression one of weary relief. "Road's clear down to the highway, Judge," he said, his voice loud in the quiet air. "Sheriff sent me up. Said a car was reported missing on this pass. Figured it might be yours." Gregory's face was a calm, impenetrable mask. "The car is a rental, belongs to my guest," he said, his voice steady, giving nothing away. "She had an accident just past my gate. She has been safe here. Thank you for your work." He was controlling the narrative, building the first wall of their defense. He handed the man a folded bill that Wendy knew was far too generous, a gesture of thanks that was also a dismissal. The man nodded, climbed back into his plow, and with a final roar of its engine, the outside world turned and rumbled back down the mountain, leaving them in a profound, ringing silence. The path was clear. She was free to go, but they both knew that leaving was no longer an option. By burning her notes, she had chosen her side. By holding her hand at the door, he had accepted her allegiance. He closed the door, shutting out the world once more, and turned to face her. The reclusive judge who had hidden from life for years was gone, replaced by the sharp, strategic mind of a prosecutor preparing for his most important case. "They will come looking for you," he said, his voice low, urgent. "Not the police. Your editor. Your friends. When you don't file a story, when you don't check in, they will start asking questions. And questions, in our world, are ammunition for our enemies." He began to pace, his mind working, piecing together a strategy. "We cannot erase your presence here, but we can redefine it. You came here as a journalist, you will leave here as my partner." Wendy's breath caught in her throat. The word hung in the air, electric with a double meaning. He didn't mean it romantically, not yet. He meant it in terms of survival, a partnership, an alliance. "What are you proposing?" she asked, her heart hammering. He stopped pacing and faced her, his gray eyes blazing with a fierce, protective intensity she had never seen before. "The lie we were going to tell is too weak," he said. "The truth is our only viable weapon, but it must be a version of the truth we control. You will go back and you will file your story, but it will not be the one you came for. It will be the story of Judge Gregory Ross, finally breaking his silence. An exclusive, and you will be the only journalist he will ever speak to, because you are the woman he is now seeing." He was offering her the greatest story of her life, but it was a gilded cage, a story that would bind her to him, making her a public figure, a target, placing her directly in the line of fire. It was a terrifying, brilliant, and utterly insane plan. It was also the only one they had. They spent the next few hours meticulously crafting their story, their new reality. It was a strange, intimate act, blending the truth of their connection with the calculated fiction of a whirlwind romance. He told her details of his public life, facts that would stand up to scrutiny. She, in turn, wrote the narrative, her journalistic skills now repurposed for their survival. It was a story of 2 lonely people finding an unlikely connection in the heart of a storm, a story that was romantic, compelling, and most importantly, a perfect misdirection from the dangerous truth. As she worked, she saw the prosecutor in him emerge. He was brilliant, anticipating every question, every angle of attack. He was a master strategist, a man who had been trained to think 10 steps ahead of his enemy. She realized with a chilling certainty that he had not been hiding in these mountains. He had been waiting for the day the war he had survived would inevitably find him again. And by crashing into his life, she had just become the new, unexpected catalyst for that war. When the narrative was complete, he went to his study and returned with a small, encrypted satellite device. "This will send your article directly to the wire services under a trusted old byline of mine," he explained. "It will bypass your editor. The story will break everywhere all at once. By the time the Delacourts realize what is happening, our version of the truth will be the only one the world knows." It was a declaration of war, disguised as a love story. Before he sent it, he looked at her, his eyes filled with a heavy, profound gravity. "Once I press this button, there is no going back, Wendy," he said. "Your name will be forever linked to mine. Their eyes will be on you. You will be in as much danger as I am." "Are you sure?" She looked back at him, at this brilliant, broken, and brave man who was willing to step back into the line of fire to protect her. She had come here chasing a story, but she was leaving with a purpose. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said. He gave a single, firm nod, and with a click of a button, their story was sent out into the world. A profound, irreversible silence filled the room. They had just thrown down the gauntlet. Now, all they could do was wait for the enemy to respond. He reached for her, pulling her into a tight, protective embrace. The fear was real, a cold knot in her stomach. But for the first time in a long time, she was not alone. In the shelter of his arms, she realized she had found something far more valuable than a headline. She had found a partner. The aftermath was immediate and explosive. The story of the reclusive judge and the journalist who had captured his heart became an international sensation. It was the perfect narrative, Beauty and the Beast, a story of love and redemption set against a dramatic, blizzard-swept landscape. It was exactly as Gregory had predicted. Their controlled version of the truth became the accepted reality. Wendy Butler was no longer a struggling journalist. She was a media darling, the woman who had melted the heart of the infamous ice judge. He drove her down the mountain himself, his powerful vehicle navigating the cleared roads with ease. The journey was quiet, fraught with the tension of their new reality. At the bottom of the mountain, where the real world began, another car was waiting for them. Inside was a man with kind eyes and a grim, professional demeanor. "This is David," Gregory said. "He's the old friend I spoke to. He'll be your security from now on. You will never be alone." The danger was now a tangible thing, a man with a holstered gun and a watchful gaze. Their goodbye was not the tender parting of lovers, but the tense, hurried farewell of two soldiers heading to different fronts. "They will test you," Gregory said, his hands gripping her arms, his eyes burning into hers. "They will try to break our story. They will dig into your life. Do not let them. You are Wendy Butler, the woman who fell in love with me. That is your shield. That is your truth." He kissed her then, a hard, desperate kiss that was both a promise and a warning. As David drove her away, back toward the city and her new, carefully constructed life, Wendy watched Gregory in the rear-view mirror until his solitary figure disappeared. She was no longer a journalist hunting for a story. She was part of the story, a character in a dangerous, high-stakes game of survival. Her career was saved, her name was made, but her life was no longer her own. She looked down at her phone, which was buzzing with an endless stream of notifications. She had the byline she had always dreamed of, but as she thought of the man she had left behind, the man who was now fighting a war for both of them from his silent mountain fortress, she knew the real story was the one that would never be written. It was a story of sacrifice, of a dangerous love, and of a promise made in the heart of a blizzard, a promise that one day, when the war was over, they would find their way back to each other. And for the first time, she had a story worth fighting for. Wendy's new life was a paradox, a gilded cage built from the headlines she had once craved. She was the toast of the journalism world, her article a viral sensation that was part human interest masterpiece, part fairy tale romance. Invitations poured in, offers for book deals, for television interviews. She played her part to perfection, smiling for cameras, speaking of Gregory with a carefully rehearsed blend of reverence and affection. But beneath the designer clothes she now wore, she felt the constant, chilling presence of David, her shadow, and the heavy weight of the secrets she carried. Her apartment, once her sanctuary, now felt like a beautifully decorated prison. She knew it was watched. Sometimes she would see it. A nondescript sedan parked across the street for too long. A man reading a newspaper at the coffee shop whose eyes weren't on the page. These were the first whispers from the Delacourt empire, the subtle, unnerving signs that she was now a person of interest. Every smile she gave, every phone call she made, was a performance for an unseen, hostile audience. Her only real contact with Gregory was through a secure, encrypted messaging app on a burner phone David had given her. Their conversations were brief, stripped of the intimacy they had shared, and focused on strategy. Maintain the narrative. Be seen. Be happy. Be in love. Each message was a command, a reminder of the role she had to play. But sometimes, late at night, a different kind of message would come through. I saw you on the news today. You were luminous. Or simply, are you safe? These were the cracks in his fortress, the glimpses of the man who had held her by the fire, and they were the only things that kept her from breaking. One evening, while attending a glitzy media gala, a mandatory performance to maintain her public profile, she felt a presence behind her. A man, impeccably dressed and older, with cold, reptilian eyes, stood a little too close. "Ms. Butler," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "A remarkable story. Truly. It takes a certain kind of woman to tame a man like Judge Ross." He introduced himself as Lucien Delacourt, a cousin of the main family. The name landed like a punch to the gut. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We knew the judge, you see. In his former life, a very passionate man, prone to attachments." The word was a veiled threat, a poisoned dart aimed directly at her. "We were all so very sorry to hear about his fiancée, Annalise. A tragedy. One hopes history doesn't repeat itself. Be well, my dear." He touched her arm, his fingers cold, a gesture of feigned politeness that felt like a brand. And then he was gone, melting back into the crowd. She stood frozen, her heart hammering, the noise of the party fading to a dull roar. The war was no longer a distant threat. It had just walked up to her, shaken her hand, and whispered its name. Wendy relayed the encounter with Lucien Delacourt to Gregory, her fingers trembling as she typed the message. The response came back almost instantly, sharp and cold. "They are testing you, probing for weakness. Do not react. Do not deviate. Your next move is critical." The cold, strategic language was a comfort, a reminder that she was not alone in this, that the brilliant mind of the prosecutor was working even from miles away. His next message, however, was anything but comforting. "There is a charity auction tomorrow night. The Delacourt Foundation is a primary sponsor. You will attend. David will have your ticket. Be beautiful, be confident, and walk into the lion's den." The thought was terrifying. He was asking her not to run from the threat, but to walk directly toward it. It went against every instinct for self-preservation she possessed. But she trusted him. She trusted his mind, and she trusted his unwavering focus on their survival. The next evening, she found herself stepping out of a black car and onto a red carpet, the flash of cameras momentarily blinding her. She wore a stunning backless emerald green gown, a piece of armor chosen to project a confidence she did not feel. The ballroom was a sea of old money and hidden power. She could feel their eyes on her, the whispers that followed in her wake. She was an outsider, an anomaly, the judge's strange new infatuation. She saw Lucien Delacourt across the room, surrounded by his family, a king holding court. He saw her, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He began to walk toward her, parting the crowd like a shark moving through water. Wendy's heart pounded, but she held her ground, a polite, curious smile fixed on her face, just as Gregory had instructed. Before Lucien could reach her, another figure intervened, a woman elegant and severe, with hair the color of spun silver and eyes as sharp and intelligent as Gregory's. She introduced herself as Eleanor Vance, a senior partner at a prestigious law firm. "I knew Judge Ross a long time ago," the woman said, her voice low and confidential, creating a small bubble of privacy around them. "He was the finest legal mind I ever encountered. What he did to the Delacourts, it was a masterpiece of justice, until they took it from him." Wendy's breath hitched. Was this another threat? He speaks very little of the past, Wendy said carefully, sticking to the script. Eleanor Vance gave a sad, knowing smile. Of course not. But some of us haven't forgotten. Some of us are still loyal to the man he was. She discreetly pressed a small, folded piece of paper into Wendy's hand. Give this to him. Tell him the Vance Commission is still active. Tell him we are ready when he is. She squeezed Wendy's hand, a gesture of solidarity, and then she was gone, leaving Wendy with a cryptic message and the dangerous, thrilling realization that Gregory was not as alone as she had thought. The war had allies she had never known about. Wendy retreated from the party as soon as she gracefully could, the small folded note clutched in her hand like a talisman. In the car, under David's watchful eye, she relayed the encounter with Eleanor Vance to Gregory. For the first time, she felt a crack in his digital composure. A long pause, then a single message. She is to be trusted. This changes things. A second message followed, more urgent. The Delacourts will see that interaction. They will interpret it as what it is, an alliance. They will escalate. You are no longer safe in the city. We are moving to the next phase. Now. The plan he outlined was terrifying in its audacity. He wasn't going to pull her out and hide her. He was going to use her as bait. He instructed her to go back to her apartment but to leave a specific light on in her study, a prearranged signal. She was to act as if everything were normal. He and his allies would handle the rest. To trust him, she had to place her life completely and utterly in his hands, relying on a network of people she had never met. She spent the next few hours in her apartment, every nerve screaming. The silence was a living entity, filled with imagined sounds, the creak of a floorboard, the whisper of a footstep in the hall. She sat in her living room, a book open on her lap, pretending to read, the study light glowing like a beacon behind her. It was the most difficult performance of her life. She was a lure, a piece of cheese in a very sophisticated trap, and she had no idea what kind of animal was about to come for it. The knock on the door came just after midnight. It was not a loud, aggressive knock, but a soft, polite tapping. David, stationed in the apartment across the hall, had given her a single instruction: open it. Her heart hammering against her ribs, she walked to the door and looked through the peephole. It was not a thug. It was Lucien Delacourt, and he was alone, a thin, polite smile on his face. This was worse. This was the snake coming into the nest itself. She opened the door. Mr. Delacourt, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. This is a surprise. He smiled. Forgive the late hour, Ms. Butler. I was just hoping for a quiet word. I have a message for you. From my family. He took a step into her apartment, and as he did, 2 more men emerged from the shadows of the hallway, moving with a swift, silent efficiency. David was not in the hall. The trap had been sprung, but it was not the one she had expected. The door clicked shut behind them, plunging the hallway into darkness. Lucien's smile widened. It was no longer polite. It was triumphant. The message is simple, he said, his voice dropping to a cold, chilling whisper. The judge needs to be reminded of what happens to the things he loves. She was trapped, and Gregory was miles away. For the first time, she was truly, utterly alone. Excellent. Here is the final, concluding part of the script. This is where all the tension pays off. Wendy's blood ran cold. But years of journalistic training in hostile situations had taught her one thing: never show fear. She looked at Lucien Delacourt, her expression not of a terrified victim, but of a confused, slightly annoyed hostess. A message? She asked, her voice calm. You could have sent a text. The sheer audacity of her response seemed to throw him off for a fraction of a second. It was a tiny crack in his triumphant facade, and in that moment, she knew Gregory's training was about one thing: controlling the narrative, no matter the circumstances. My family prefers a personal touch, Lucien said, recovering his composure. He nodded to his men, who began to move into her apartment, their eyes scanning everything, looking for threats, for exits. They were professionals. You see, we've become quite concerned about Judge Ross. Hiding away in the mountains now, this sudden, very public romance. It's erratic. We thought perhaps a conversation with you might help us understand his state of mind. He was playing a game, and she had to play along. His state of mind is happy, Wendy said simply. Something I doubt your family knows much about." Before Lucian could respond, a soft chime came from the small, encrypted burner phone she had left on her coffee table. Lucian's eyes darted to it. "Is that him now?" he asked, a predatory curiosity in his voice. He gestured to one of his men. "Bring it here." The man picked up the phone and handed it to Lucian. It was a text message from a number he didn't recognize. Lucian's confident smile faltered as he read the message. He read it again, his face paling, the color draining from his cheeks. A look of pure, unadulterated shock, followed by a wave of cold, dawning horror washed over him. He looked up at Wendy, no longer with the eyes of a predator, but with the eyes of a man who had just realized he was not the hunter, but the prey. His men, seeing the look on his face, tensed, their hands moving instinctively toward their jackets. The phone in Lucian's hand chimed again. A second message. He looked at it, and his hand began to tremble. He slowly, deliberately, placed the burner phone back on the coffee table and looked at Wendy. "There has been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice tight, strained. He gave a curt nod to his men. "We are leaving." They retreated from the apartment as silently and as swiftly as they had appeared, the threat dissolving like a phantom in the night. The door clicked shut, leaving Wendy alone, her heart hammering, her body trembling with the adrenaline of the aftermath. She walked on shaky legs to the phone and picked it up. She read the two messages that had saved her life. The first message was a simple, elegant line of code, a banking transaction number. The second message was a photo. It was a live feed from a security camera, showing a bank vault in Zurich. Inside, a woman with silver hair stood calmly beside a bank manager. The woman was Eleanor Vance, and she was systematically emptying every single offshore account belonging to the Delacourt family. Wendy sank onto her sofa, the phone clutched in her hand, a wave of dizzying relief washing over her. It was a checkmate, a move so brilliant, so unexpected, that it had dismantled an empire in a single, silent stroke. Gregory hadn't set a trap for Lucien's men. He had set a trap for his money, the one thing he knew the Delacourts could not afford to lose. While Lucien was playing games with her, Gregory and his allies were executing a meticulously planned financial coup decades in the making. An hour later, her own door opened, and David stepped inside, his expression calm but his eyes filled with a profound respect. "It's over, Ms. Butler," he said. "They're finished. They'll be so busy trying to salvage their assets and fighting off federal investigations, they won't have time to worry about you or the judge for the rest of their lives. The war wasn't just over. It had been won, not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating click of a keyboard." A car was waiting for her downstairs. There were no words exchanged, no destination given. She just knew. The car drove through the night, leaving the glittering artificial lights of the city behind, heading back toward the dark, honest silhouette of the mountains. She arrived at the base of his private road just as the sun was beginning to rise, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of rose and gold. And he was there, waiting for her, standing beside his vehicle, no longer a ghost in exile, but a man standing in the dawn of his own reclaimed life. She stepped out of the car and he met her halfway. They didn't speak. There were no words for the terror, the trust, the absolute triumph of the last 12 hours. He pulled her into his arms, and this embrace was not one of desperation or farewell, but of a profound, peaceful homecoming. He held her for a long time, the cold mountain air on their faces, the warmth of the rising sun on their backs. "I was never afraid," she whispered into his chest. "I knew you were coming." He pulled back, his hands framing her face, and the look in his eyes was one of awe, of wonder, and of a love so deep it was bottomless. The guarded, grieving judge was gone forever, replaced by the man he was always meant to be. Brave, brilliant, and finally, free. "Annalise gave me a reason to fight," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you, Wendy, you gave me a reason to win." He kissed her then, a slow, gentle kiss that held the promise of 1,000 quiet mornings, of a future no longer defined by the ghosts of the past, but by the shared strength they had found in each other. They had been trapped by a blizzard, but in the heart of that storm they had uncovered more than a hidden past. They had found a dangerous, beautiful, and enduring love. And as they stood together on the mountain, Ready to build a new life in the quiet peace they had fought so hard to win, they both knew the real story had only just begun. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment. What do you think the first chapter of Wendy and Gregory's new life together will look like?